Welcome back. We're picking up where we left off. And last time we spent our time analyzing how 9 whole chapters of genealogy basically serve as the thesis statement of Chronicles.
Right, the really long lists of names.
Exactly, those sweeping lists. But today, we are going to see that thesis put to work on an actual human being, which is King David.
Yeah, finally moving into the narrative.
Right. And since you are likely already familiar with the biblical text of David's life, from the books of Samuel, our objective today isn't just to retell the story.
No, that would be redundant.
Yeah, exactly. We are going to look really closely at the architecture of the narrative itself. So, just to lay out the agenda for this deep dive, first, we will establish the historical grounding of David's reign.
The actual historical bedrock.
Right, looking at the archaeology, the geopolitics, and the narrative context that allowed a united monarchy to exist at all.
Which is super important before we get to the theology.
Definitely. Then we will make a brief scholarly pivot into the analytical questions that guide the reading of First Chronicles.
Kind of setting our lenses for the text.
Yep. From there, we will explore our first thematic section, which is the idealized David. We'll examine the chronicler's deliberate omissions, what he chooses to retain, and this is key, how he relocates David's moral failures.
Yeah, the relocation is fascinating.
It really is. After that, we move into our second thematic section, analyzing how the Levites are reimagined as musicians and liturgists. We'll specifically explore the massive institutional expansions detailed in chapters 23 through 26.
The really dense institutional chapters.
Right, the ones people usually skip. And finally, we will conclude with a devotional close, reflecting on the theological weight of the text and its implications for personal worship, especially drawing on some come follow me themes.
I think it's a profound shift in reading strategy today. I mean, we are moving from the sweeping lists of names we covered last week right into the meticulous workshop of an editor.
A workshop is a good way to put it.
Yeah, because we are reading a writer who has the older records right in front of him. And he is making, hundreds of deliberate decisions about what to keep, what to cut, what to rewrite, and where to place the theological emphasis for his specific audience.
Before we look at those theological edits, though, let's establish that historical bedrock. Because if we strip away the theology of Chronicles for a minute, what can we actually say about David as a historical figure with reasonable confidence based on the current data?
Well, that question has been the subject of really intense and sometimes pretty fractured debate for decades.
It gets heated.
Oh, very heated. For a long time, there was a prominent strand of minimalist scholarship, often associated with archaeologists like Israel Finkelstein at Tel Aviv University.
Right, the minimalists.
Yeah, and this school of thought basically argued that the biblical united monarchy of David and Solomon, the idea of a large centralized state dominating the region, was largely a retroactive literary construction.
But it was made up later to make them look good.
Exactly. And the argument was rooted in the dirt of Jerusalem itself. Because if you excavate in Jerusalem and look specifically at the strata corresponding to the 10th century BCE, you do not find the sprawling, monumental administrative complexes you would expect from a massive empire.
There's no giant palace sticking out of the ground?
No, not at all. Finkelstein and others pointed out that 10th century Jerusalem appears archaeologically as, well, just a relatively small highland town.
Just a local village, basically.
Right. So based on that lack of monumental architecture, the minimalist argument suggested that David, if he existed as a historical person at all, was likely just a local chieftain, not an emperor with a vast bureaucracy.
But the parameters of that debate shifted pretty significantly in the 1990s, right? Due to a specific discovery in northern Israel.
Yes, it really did. This happened at an excavation site called Tel Dan. In 1993, an archaeological team led by Avraham Biren was working on a plaza outside the ancient city gates there.
And it was almost an accidental find, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's a great story. A surveyor named Gila Cook was walking by, and she happened to glance at a basalt stone that had been reused in a later wall. And the afternoon sunlight hit it in just such a way that she noticed inscribed letters on it.
Oh, wow. Just the right lighting at the right time of day.
Exactly. And that stone, along with other pieces they found the following year, became known as the Tel Dan Stele.
And this wasn't an Israelite monument, was it?
No, it's written in Aramaic, dating to the 9th century BCE. It was likely commissioned by King Hazael of Damascus.
An enemy king.
Right. And on it, this Aramean king boasts of his military victories over the king of Israel and the king of Judah. But the specific phrase he uses to describe the southern kingdom is by Benthadu, which translates to the house of David.
So we have this external non-Israelite inscription carved into stone just a century or so after David would have lived, directly referring to the southern kingdom by the name of its founding dynasty.
Yes, it is an adversary literally bragging about fighting David's descendants.
I know there was some pushback initially on how to translate it, right?
Yeah. Oh, definitely. While there were initial debates, some scholars tried to argue it meant house of the uncle, or maybe a place name. The consensus rapidly settled. I mean, the inscription clearly refers to the Davidic dynasty.
And that completely changed the landscape of the scholarship.
It fundamentally ended the debate over David's historical existence. We are no longer arguing about whether David was a real person. The debate has narrowed to discussing the scale, population density, and centralization of his state.
Okay, so to understand how a local Israelite consolidation was even possible back then, we really need to look at the broader geopolitical map of the 10th century BCE.
We do, yeah.
Because the Levantine corridor, which encompasses modern-day Israel, Lebanon, and Syria, is essentially this narrow land bridge connecting the heavyweights of the ancient world.
Right, it's the highway between empires.
Exactly. You have Egypt to the south, and you have the powers of Mesopotamia to the north and east. And historically, one of those empires is usually projecting power through this corridor and dominating it.
But the 10th century BCE offers this very specific temporary power vacuum. It's really unique.
Because of the Bronze Age collapse.
Yeah, the late Bronze Age collapse had already fractured the older, stable systems of the region. So Egypt is enduring a period of serious weakness. The late New Kingdom has faded, and during the 21st dynasty, Egypt is totally internally divided.
Like a civil war situation.
Basically, power is split between Tanis in the north and the high priests of Amnon at Thebes in the south. So they are simply not in a position to project serious military or political force up into the Levant.
And what about the other side of the map? What's keeping Mesopotamia out?
On the Mesopotamian side, the Middle Assyrian Empire has declined, and the Neo-Assyrian juggernaut, the empire that will eventually destroy the northern kingdom of Israel, well, it has not yet begun its westward expansion in earnest.
So they're quiet for a bit.
Right. So for a relatively brief window in history, this vital land bridge is uncontested by the regional superpowers.
How does recognizing that specific geopolitical power vacuum between Egypt and Assyria change the way we read the biblical claims of David's military dominance? Because if you read the Bible, it sounds like he conquered the known world.
Well, it grounds those claims in historical plausibility. I mean, it tells us that whatever the exact borders of David's kingdom were, the external conditions allowed for local state building.
He had room to breathe.
Exactly. David is not taking the field against Ramesses II, and he's not fighting the massed chariots of the Assyrian army. He is fighting the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Edomites, and the Arameans.
People his own size.
Right, he is fighting local and regional powers of roughly analogous size and capability. The temporary absence of an overarching superpower is the prerequisite that allows a highly capable, shrewd leader to unite the highland tribes, forge alliances, and consolidate a functioning state.
So let's vividly recall the narrative context that First Chronicles assumes its readers know. Because the world David steps into is one of absolute chaos and collapse.
Oh, it's a disaster.
Saul, Israel's first king, sees his reign end violently on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines, who are the dominant coastal power at the time, break the Israelite lines. Saul's sons, including Jonathan, are killed.
It's a total slaughter.
And Saul himself, badly wounded by archers, falls on his own sword. The defeat is so total that the Israelite towns in the Jezreel Valley are just abandoned, and the Philistines claim the territory. And then they take the bodies of Saul and his sons and pin them to the wall of Bethshan as public trophies.
It is a devastating national humiliation, just total psychological defeat. And out of that collapse, David steps forward. But the text of Samuel makes clear he does not step out of nowhere.
No, he's been busy.
Yeah, David is a hardened military commander with his own loyal, independent fighting force. He has spent years living as a fugitive, hunted by Saul. He has survived in the Judean wilderness, essentially running protection operations for local herders.
Kind of like a mafia boss setup, right?
Honestly, a bit like that.
But
And he's eventually crossed over to become a vassal of the Philistines down in Ziklag.
And his time at Ziklag is a period of intense political maneuvering. He is playing a very dangerous double game there. He's convincing his Philistine overlord, Achish, that he is raiding his own people in the Negeb of Judah.
But he's not actually doing that.
Right. In reality, he is systematically attacking Israel's enemies, like the Amalekites and others, and funneling the captured wealth back to the elders of Judah to basically purchase their future allegiance.
It's brilliant statecraft. And when news of Saul's death finally reaches him, David's ascension is not a peaceful, unanimous transition. The books of Samuel detail a long, brutal civil war.
Right, it doesn't happen overnight.
No, David is anointed king over the tribe of Judah at Hebron, but Saul's surviving son, Ish-bosheth, is propped up by Saul's general, Abner, as the king over the northern tribes.
So you have two rival kings.
Exactly. And it is a period of constant skirmishes, betrayals, and political assassinations. It really only ends when Abner defects to David and is then murdered by David's general Joab, which is followed shortly by the assassination of Ish-bosheth in his own bed by two of his own captains.
Just a bloody, messy rise to power. And even after David wins that civil war and the northern tribes finally submit to him, the kingdom is still geographically and politically fractured.
Very much so.
Which explains why his capture of Jerusalem is such a critical move. Jerusalem at this time is a heavily fortified Jebusite city. It sits right on the border between the northern tribal territories, specifically Benjamin, and the southern territory of Judah.
But crucially, it has never been conquered by either of them.
Right. It is neutral ground. So when David's forces capture it, he does not assign it to a tribe. He claims it as his personal possession, the city of David. He creates a capital that carries absolutely no prior tribal baggage. It is a unifying center precisely because no single tribe can claim historical ownership of it.
It is a masterstroke of political pragmatism. But, David understands that political unity requires religious centralization too. And this is where the history of the Ark of the Covenant becomes essential to his plan.
Because the Ark has a long, troubled history leading up to this moment.
It really does. Back in 1 Samuel 4, during the time of Eli, the Israelites bring the Ark into battle against the Philistines at Aphek. They're basically treating it like a divine talisman, like a magic weapon.
Which totally backfires.
Completely. The Philistines capture it, but then it brings plague and devastation to their own cities, Ashdod, Gath, Ekron. So they eventually just return it to Israelite territory on a cart pulled by milk cows.
Just trying to get rid of it.
Yeah. But rather than returning to a central sanctuary, the Ark ends up in the hill country town of Kiriath Jearim, and it simply stays there.
It just sits there, effectively dormant for decades. Throughout the entire reign of Saul, the central object of Israelite worship is ignored. Saul never once attempts to bring it to his capital at Gibeah.
Exactly. Therefore, David's decision to bring the Ark to Jerusalem is a highly calculated act of statecraft and theology combined. He is taking the ancient revered symbol of the tribal confederacy and fusing it to his new monarchic capital.
Uniting the religious and the political.
Right. He is telling the people that the God of Sinai and the God of the judges has now permanently taken up residence in the city of the king.
Okay, so that is the complex, violent, historically layered reality of David's rise. But here is where we must pivot in our deep dive today. Because the messy historical reality detailed in the books of Samuel is not what we are reading when we open our own chronicles.
No, it is not at all what we're reading. We are reading the work of the chronicler. And as we established in our discussion of the genealogies last time, the chronicler is operating in the Persian period, in the province of Yehud.
So long after David.
Right, long after the Babylonian exile and the end of the Davidic monarchy. He is engaged in what scholars call interbiblical exegesis. He has the scrolls of Samuel and Kings and other older sources available to him on his desk.
But he's not just copying them.
Exactly. He is writing a new work for a new context. He has real editorial control, and he is constructing a specific theological argument about covenant continuity, the temple, and the ideal Israel.
So to understand how he does this, we need to read 1 Chronicles with 2 main analytical questions in mind.
Okay, what are they?
First, what does the chronicler do with the morally catastrophic parts of David's story? Because the David of Samuel is a man of profound faith, but also a man of devastating moral failures and bloodshed.
Right, he's very flawed in Samuel.
And second, why does the chronicler suddenly introduce massive, highly structured institutional details about Levites, musicians, and temple offices for a building that David historically never even saw built?
Let us begin with that first question and examine the character of David as the chronicler constructs him. Because we see the chronicler's editorial hand before David even takes the throne.
Really? Where?
Look at how chapter 10 handles the death of Saul. In 1 Samuel, the narrative of Saul's death on Mount Gilboa is layered with tragic ambiguity. You see a king abandoned by God, facing an overwhelming enemy, yet he's still fighting.
It's very Shakespearean.
It is. You see his armor-bearer refusing to strike him down out of reverence for the anointed king, which leads to Saul's suicide. Samuel basically leaves the theological interpretation largely up to the reader to ponder.
But Chronicles does not leave it to the reader at all. The chronicler recounts the battle, but then he explicitly appends the theological verdict right at the end. 1 Chronicles 10, verses 13 and 14 state, quote, "So Saul died for his transgression, which he committed against the Lord, even against the word of the Lord, which he kept not, and also for asking counsel of one that had a familiar spirit to inquire of it, and inquired not of the Lord. Therefore he slew him, and turned the kingdom unto David the son of Jesse."
See, the chronicler completely removes the ambiguity. He diagnoses the failure precisely. Saul died because of his unfaithfulness and for consulting the medium at Endor instead of inquiring of the Lord.
It's very cut and dry.
Right. The text provides a clear causal link between disobedience and the loss of the kingdom. And immediately following this diagnosis, we encounter the chronicler's first massive structural omission.
Oh, the missing decades. Because if you are reading 2 Samuel, the period following Saul's death spans chapters 2 through 4, detailing that agonizing civil war we just talked about.
The really messy stuff.
Yeah, we read about the rival kingdom in Mahanaim, the skirmishes at the Pool of Gibeon where young men are literally slaughtering each other, the prolonged war between the two houses. We read about Abner's politically motivated defection, Joab murdering Abner to avenge his brother Asahel, and the brutal assassination of Ish-bosheth.
And the chronicler excises all of it. Every bit of it. Chapter 10 ends with Saul's death, and chapter 11 opens immediately with these words. "Then all Israel gathered themselves to David unto Hebron, saying, Behold, we are thy bone and thy flesh."
It's like none of the bad stuff happened.
Exactly. The transition from the death of the failed king to the coronation of the chosen king is presented as immediate, seamless, and entirely unanimous.
And this directly serves the all-Israel ideology we discussed in the genealogies. Chapters 11 and 12 construct a completely idealized coronation. The text lists warriors streaming in from every single tribe to transfer the kingdom to David.
And the language is highly deliberate.
Oh, absolutely. The men of Issachar are described as men that had understanding of the times to know what Israel ought to do. The text explicitly states they came with a perfect heart to make David king, and that all the rest also of Israel were of one heart to make David king.
Because a multi-year bloody civil war fundamentally contradicts the theological premise of a unified Israel acting with one heart to establish God's anointed. So the civil war is just omitted.
We have to be clear about the sheer volume of narrative material the chronicler removes here. It's staggering.
It really is.
He cuts nearly 2 decades of recorded events. He omits the Civil War, the entirety of the Bathsheba and Uriah narrative, the rape of Tamar by Amnon, Absalom's revenge, Absalom's massive rebellion that forces David to flee Jerusalem weeping over the Mount of Olives, and the subsequent revolt of Sheba. The vast majority of the political and moral complexity found in 2 Samuel is simply gone.
But, the chronicler is not merely reducing the text. He also expands it when it serves his theological program.
Give me an example of that.
Well, for instance, in chapter 11, we get the roster of David's mighty men. This parallels a list found at the very end of 2 Samuel, but the list in Chronicles runs much longer, from verses 10 through 47.
So he's adding names.
Right. And scholars like Ralph Klein have pointed out that this expansion indicates the chronicler is drawing on independent, older traditions. He isn't just inventing names, he's utilizing existing records to bolster the stature and scale of David's early coalition.
Let me stop and map this out logically, though, because there seems to be a real contradiction in the chronicler's method here.
Okay, what do you see?
If the goal is to remove 2 decades of civil war, rebellion, and moral failure to create this pristine, unified theological ideal, why does he keep Joab in the narrative?
That's a great point.
Because in the books of Samuel, Joab is the ruthless enforcer. He's the man who murders political rivals in peacetime and disobeys David's direct orders, most notably by killing Absalom. If you are cleaning up David's image, why keep Joab? And more specifically, why keep Joab's vocal opposition to David during the census later in chapter 21?
It is a critical question, and it reveals that the chronicler is not simply writing flat propaganda. Joab is retained initially because he is the military architect of the conquest of Jerusalem in chapter 11, which secures his position as chief captain.
So he needs him for the history of Jerusalem.
Right. But retaining Joab's specific objection during the census is a crucial editorial decision. It demonstrates that the king is not just surrounded by yes-men. When David orders the census, Joab pushes back, asking, why will he be a cause of trespass to Israel?
He literally tells the king he's making a mistake.
Exactly. And preserving that pushback serves a vital function. It sets up the central mechanism of the chronicler's method, which is the diagnosis of failure.
And we see this diagnostic method really clearly in the narrative of the first failed attempt to move the ark in chapter 13. This is an episode that ends in absolute disaster, yet the chronicler retains it.
He doesn't cut the bad stuff if it serves a purpose.
Right. So David gathers the people. They place the ark on a new cart driven by Uzzah and Ahio. The oxen stumble. Uzzah reaches out his hand to steady the ark, and he is immediately struck dead.
It's terrifying.
And the procession just halts. The text frankly admits that David was angry and then terrified, asking, "How shall I bring the ark of God home to me?" So the ark is diverted to the house of Obed-Edom.
The chronicler keeps the disaster, but he provides something that Samuel does not. A clear theological diagnosis. When David attempts to move the ark again in chapter 15, he gathers the priests and Levites, and he says in verse 13, "For because he did it not at the first, the Lord our God made a breach upon us, for that we sought him not after the due order."
The phrase due order is doing a lot of heavy lifting there.
Precisely. The diagnosis is procedural and legal. According to the legislation in Numbers regarding the Kohathites, the ark was supposed to be carried on the shoulders of the Levites using specific poles.
Not on an ox cart?
Right, it was not meant to be hauled on a cart like a piece of agricultural cargo, which notably was exactly how the Philistines transported it. So the chronicler uses the failure of the first attempt to justify and necessitate the exact kind of proper, codified Levitical procedure that his own post-exilic community needs to maintain.
So the failure is not hidden. It is repurposed as a teaching mechanism.
Exactly.
There is also a quiet structural contrast the chronicler builds to illustrate proper leadership. Look at chapter 14, just prior to the ark's successful arrival. David faces 2 consecutive Philistine incursions in the valley of Rephaim.
Right, the Philistines' attack.
And before engaging, David explicitly inquires of God, "Shall I go up against the Philistines, and wilt thou deliver them into mine hand?" He asks, he receives an affirmative answer, and he wins.
Simple obedience.
Then the Philistines return, and David inquires again. This time, he doesn't just get a yes or no. He receives specific tactical advice to circle behind them and wait for the sound of marching in the tops of the mulberry trees. Inquiry leads to revelation, which leads to victory.
And that model of inquiry stands in sharp contrast to his later actions during the census. During the census, David does not inquire of the Lord. He acts totally unilaterally.
He even ignores Joab's warning.
Right, he ignores the counsel of his own commander. The structural juxtaposition is clear. When the king inquires and obeys, the nation prospers. When the king acts unilaterally and relies on human strength, catastrophe follows.
We also see the chronicler managing the forward-looking image of the Davidic dynasty. In chapter 17, we read Nathan's oracle, which is the foundational text of the Davidic covenant. This closely parallels 2 Samuel 7.
It's almost verbatim in some parts.
But in the Samuel account, when God speaks of the son who will build the temple, he adds a very specific conditional warning. "If he commit iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men and with the stripes of the children of men."
It's an explicit anticipation that David's royal successors will sin and require divine discipline.
But the chronicler's version of that oracle in chapter 17 is identical in many respects, except he executes a surgical edit. He completely drops the clause about chastening with the rod of men.
Just deletes it.
Yes, he removes the textual anticipation of royal sin entirely. The covenant in Chronicles is presented as an unconditional promise of an eternal house, focusing on the ideal nature of the dynasty rather than the historical failures of the kings who followed Solomon.
Which brings us to the census in chapter 21, which is perhaps the most fascinating editorial decision in the entire book.
Oh, it's wild to compare the 2 accounts.
It is, because in the older account in 2 Samuel 24, the narrative begins with a deeply unsettling statement. And again, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he moved David against them to say, "Go number Israel and Judah."
In the older text, God himself incites the king to commit the sin.
Right, and then God sends a plague to punish the nation for that very sin. It presents a massive theological tension regarding divine agency and human culpability.
So how does the chronicler resolve that tension? He uses a profound theological relocation. 1 Chronicles 21 opens with these words, "And Satan stood up against Israel and provoked David to number Israel."
Let's pause and map this carefully, because crossing out God and writing in Satan as the inciting force is a monumental shift.
It's huge.
It is, and it reflects a broader trajectory in the theology of the Second Temple period. If you look at older texts, such as the prologue to the book of Job or the visions in Zechariah, The Hebrew word used is ha-Satan.
What does that prefix mean?
The Hebrew prefix hat is the definite article, the. So it's,
Right.
is a title, not a proper name. The Satan means the adversary or the accuser. And in those older texts, this figure operates within the divine council, functioning almost like a heavenly prosecuting attorney.
Pointing out people's flaws.
Exactly. He challenges human righteousness, but he does so strictly with God's permission. However, by the time the chronicler is writing in the later Persian or early Hellenistic period, we see this concept evolving.
It shifts to a proper name.
Right, the definite article drops away.
Yes.
Satan becomes a proper noun, an independent entity whose primary function is to oppose God's purposes and tempt humanity.
So the chronicler utilizes this developing theological concept to solve the problem he inherited from Samuel. By having Satan provoke David, God is no longer the author of the temptation.
God is cleared of the instigation.
Yet, importantly, the chronicler does not use this to exonerate David. David is still entirely guilty. He succumbed to the provocation. The plague still falls on Israel, and 70,000 men die. The consequences remain absolute.
Exactly. It is a recalibration of agency. The temptation originates with the adversary, but the culpability remains squarely on the shoulders of the king.
We should also acknowledge the textual discrepancies regarding the numbers in the census, because they really highlight the complex nature of ancient records.
The numbers don't match up.
Not at all. In 2 Samuel, the census reports 800,000 valiant men who drew the sword in Israel and 500,000 in Judah. But in Chronicles, the figures are 11,100,000 in Israel and 470,000 in Judah.
And the chronicler adds a detail that Joab found the king's words so abominable that he refused to count the tribes of Levi and Benjamin.
Which is interesting because some commentators over the centuries have attempted really complex mathematical gymnastics trying to use those uncounted tribes to harmonize the totals across the two books.
Try to make the math work out.
Yeah, but honestly, it is more intellectually sound to just recognize that the chronicler is likely relying on a divergent textual tradition for his numbers, and he simply leaves the discrepancy unresolved.
What he does resolve, however, and resolves brilliantly, is the etiology, the origin story of the temple site itself.
How so?
Well, in the Samuel account, David sees the angel of the Lord by the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. He buys the threshing floor, builds an altar, offers sacrifices, and the plague is stayed. The story just ends there.
It's just a localized event.
Right. The chronicler, however, takes this event and turns it into the foundational moment of Israel's institutional worship. After the sacrifices are accepted by fire from heaven, the chronicler adds a crucial declaration from David in chapter 22, verse 1. Then David said, "This is the house of the Lord God, and this is the altar of the burnt offering for Israel."
Wow, the theological weight of that addition is
That
immense.
changes everything.
Because the chronicler is taking the worst institutional disaster of David's reign, a plague caused by royal hubris that results in mass death, and making that exact geographical location the permanent chosen site for the temple.
And identifying that site triggers the immediate logic of David's disqualification from actually building the structure.
Right, because David can't build it.
No. In chapter 22, David calls for his young son Solomon, and he explains why he, the great king, cannot build the house. Verse 8 says, "But the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Thou hast shed blood abundantly, and hast made great wars. Thou shalt not build an house unto my name, because thou hast shed much blood upon the earth in my sight."
Let me make sure I'm mapping this correctly against the older texts. Because in the Deuteronomistic history, which is the theology driving Samuel and King's sin, usually results in multi-generational curses, doesn't it?
Yes, the consequences bleed down through the generations.
Right. For example, after the Bathsheba and Uriah disaster in 2 Samuel 12, the prophet Nathan tells David that the sword will never depart from his house. And we see that curse play out brutally in the rapes, murders, and rebellions among his children.
It's a generational nightmare.
But Chronicles cuts the Bathsheba narrative. So by isolating the consequence of David's bloodshed to a specific architectural prohibition, meaning he just cannot build the temple, does the chronicler effectively decouple the institution of the monarchy from the personal moral failings of the monarch?
He absolutely does. In the chronicler's theology, the consequence is immediate and highly localized. Because David is a man of war, he is personally barred from constructing the house of peace.
But it doesn't ruin his kids.
Exactly. The consequence goes no further. His dynasty is not cursed. His throne is not compromised. Solomon inherits the kingdom entirely untainted by his father's blood guilt.
Scholars like Sarah Jeffett and Gary Knoppers have pointed out that we often use the word sanitizing to describe what the chronicler does to David, but that word implies a simple erasure. It implies he just deleted the bad parts to make a flat, perfect hero.
And that is a really inadequate reading. The chronicler is engaged in something far more sophisticated. He omits the events that fundamentally contradict his premise of all Israel unity, like the Civil War. But he retains and purposefully relocates David's failures when they serve to construct the larger theological architecture of the book.
The failures are repurposed.
Yes, Uzzah's death is repurposed to establish Levitical law. The devastating census becomes the mechanism to consecrate the Temple Mount. David's history of bloodshed provides the theological rationale for his exclusion from the building project, thereby preserving the purity of the sanctuary itself. The chronicler manages the tradition. He doesn't just erase it.
Preserving the purity and order of those institutions is paramount. And that brings us to the second major theme of our discussion today. The massive institutional expansions found in chapters 23 through 26, where the Levites are reimagined not just as porters who carry things, but as musicians and liturgists.
This section of Chronicles is remarkable because it has virtually no parallel in the books of Samuel. In our analysis of the genealogies, we saw how chapter 6 specifically located David's appointed singers within the inheritance of Levi. Here, in the narrative section, we get the exhaustive operational details of that appointment.
The groundwork is laid in chapters 15 and 16 during the successful relocation of the Ark. The text provides incredible granular detail here. It names the specific Levitical families responsible for carrying the Ark, and then it names the individuals appointed over the music, Asaph, Heman, and Ethan or Jeduthun.
And it specifies their instruments, too.
Right, harps, psalteries, and cymbals of brass. These men are established as the heads of the singing guilds, which are positions their descendants will hold for centuries.
And then, in chapter 16, the chronicler performs a stunning act of literary compilation. After the ark is set in the tent, verse 7 states, that on that day David delivered first this psalm to thank the Lord into the hand of Asaph and his brethren.
So he introduces a new psalm.
Well, what follows from verse 8 to 36 is presented as the original inaugural psalm composed by David for this specific historical moment.
But if you cross-reference the text, you realize it is a composite. It's actually stitched together from 3 different psalms that existed independently in the Psalter.
Exactly. The chronicler takes the first 15 verses of Psalm 105, which praise God for his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He follows that with the entirety of Psalm 96, calling on the earth to sing to the Lord and declare his glory among the nations. And he concludes with the opening and closing verses of Psalm 106, a communal cry to be gathered from among the heathen.
Why pick those specific verses, though?
Because they perfectly articulate the theology of the post-exilic community in Yehud. I mean, they need the reassurance of the ancient covenant, they need to assert God's sovereignty over the Persian Empire that rules them, and they are acutely aware of the reality of the diaspora, the need to be gathered from the nations.
So he's taking the liturgy his own community is currently singing in the Second Temple.
And he's inserting it into the foundational narrative of the First Temple. By presenting this composite psalm as David's own composition, he grants his contemporary worship practices a profound, authorizing Davidic pedigree.
It is the exact same strategy he used with the genealogical lists to establish legitimacy, but applied to liturgy.
Exactly.
The institutional detail expands massively in chapters 23 through 26. These chapters contain lists of divisions, duties, and names. It is the section readers are most tempted to skip over, but we really cannot afford to skip it because it is the structural blueprint of Second Temple Judaism.
It's the DNA of their worship.
For instance, chapter 24 details the organization of the priesthood. The descendants of Aaron, through the lines of Eleazar and Ithamar, specifically Zadok and Ahimelech, are divided by lot into 24 courses or shifts.
And that specific organizational structure has a direct, visible historical through line into the New Testament period.
Wait, really? Where do we see that?
Centuries later, in the opening chapter of the Gospel of Luke, we are introduced to an aging priest named Zechariah, who is the father of John the Baptist. Luke provides a specific institutional detail. He says Zechariah was of the course of Abia.
Oh, interesting.
Now, Abia is the Greek rendering of Abijah. You look at 1 Chronicles 24.10, the 8th course of the 24 is assigned to Abijah. So the rotation system formalized in this Persian period text is the exact system operating when the angel Gabriel appears in the temple to Zechariah.
That is an amazing connection. We also encounter a fascinating internal textual tension regarding the Levites in chapter 23. Verse 24 states that the Levites are to begin their service in the house of the Lord from the age of 20 years and upward.
Which seems straightforward until you check the older texts.
Right, because if you know the legislation in the Torah, this creates a major conflict. Numbers chapter 4 sets the age for Levitical service at 30. Numbers chapter 8 sets it at 25. So within the biblical corpus, we have three completely different age requirements for the exact same office.
The most sound historical explanation for the shift down to age 20 in Chronicles lies in the demographics of the post-exilic period.
Because there just weren't enough people.
Exactly. When the exiles returned to Yehud to rebuild the temple, their numbers were relatively small, and the economic conditions were harsh. They simply did not have a massive population of mature men available. By lowering the age of conscription to 20, they expanded the pool of available labor required to maintain the temple operations.
So as a practical necessity.
Yes. The chronicler is not trying to artificially harmonize his texts with the books of Moses. He is reflecting the practical, institutional reality of his own day, and he's attributing that necessary reform back to the authority of David.
Chapter 25 turns to the organization of the singers, again dividing them into 24 courses under the leadership of Asaph, Heman, and Jeduthun. But the language used to describe their function is astonishing.
It's a huge theological leap.
Verse 1 states that these men were separated to the service who should prophesy with harps, with psalteries, and with cymbals, prophesying with instruments. That completely changes how we view their role. They are not merely providing musical accompaniment to the sacrifices.
It is a radical theological elevation of the musician. John Kleinig, in his excellent monograph, The Lord's Song, explores this in depth. He points out that in the ancient Near East and within Israelite theology, prophecy is not merely about predicting the future.
It's broader than that.
Right? Prophecy is about mediating the divine presence. The chronicler is making the claim that the highly structured instrumental and vocal music performed by the Levites functions with the same revelatory weight as the spoken oracles of classical prophets like Isaiah or Jeremiah.
So the music itself is a vehicle for revelation.
Yes. The music is a vehicle for divine encounter. The musicians are essentially cultic prophets.
And the chronicler's impulse to organize does not stop at the temple threshold. Chapters 26 and 27 extend this divine order to the entire state apparatus. We read detailed assignments for the gatekeepers, who serve as the security force and custodians of the temple complex. We read about the treasurers who manage the dedicated resources.
It just keeps expanding.
Then, chapter 27 shifts to the civil and military administration. It lists 12 military divisions of 24,000 men each, rotating on a monthly basis. It lists the chief officers over the tribes and the administrators overseeing the king's private properties, his fields, vineyards, olive trees, and herds.
By detailing all of this, the chronicler is arguing that the entire civil, military, and economic administration of the Israelite state was laid out with exhaustive divine legitimacy. The kingdom was not a haphazard political evolution. It was a revealed order.
But this forces us to confront a significant historical reality, one pointed out by scholars like H.G.M. Williamson and Gary Knoppers. David never saw a temple.
Right, he died before it was built.
The building did not exist during his lifetime. Solomon builds it years later. Yet we are reading about 24 priestly courses, complex singing guilds, and gatekeepers functioning as a fully operational system under David for a building that is still entirely conceptual.
This is the phenomenon of retrojection. The chronicler is looking at the complex, fully functioning institutions of the Second Temple in his own Persian period present. And in order to secure the maximum possible legitimacy for those institutions that were likely the result of centuries of adaptation and reform, he projects them backward in time.
He ties them to David to make them official.
He anchors them in the founding authority of Israel's greatest king. He is stating theologically that the practices of his day are not later inventions, they are the original authorized design.
There's a really compelling parallel here for Latter-day Saint listeners, one often explored by historians in journals like BYU Studies. When you examine the development of priesthood organization in the 19th century Restoration, you see a very human historical process.
It didn't emerge fully formed on day one.
Exactly. You see early ad hoc gatherings like the School of Prophets or informal leadership structures adapting to immediate needs. Over time, those practices are formalized into enduring, revealed structures, specific quorums, presidencies, and courses of service. The historical context between Yehud and Nauvoo are obviously entirely different, but the underlying theological logic is strikingly similar.
They both require an origin point.
Right. In both frameworks, legitimate sacred institutions must ultimately trace their authority and origin to a founding moment of revelatory organization by an inspired leader, rather than just being viewed as the accumulation of human tradition.
That is a very apt structural comparison.
Yeah.
And the Chronicler makes that claim of revelatory origin explicit in chapter 28.
Yeah.
David gathers the leaders of Israel, and he hands Solomon the tabnet, which is the Hebrew word for pattern or blueprint for the temple, the porches, the treasuries, and the instruments of service.
And he claims he got it from God.
Yes. David says in verse 19, "All this," said David, "the Lord made me understand in writing by his hand upon me, even all the works of this pattern."
So if the blueprint of the temple and its operations is a direct revelation from the Spirit, literally written by the hand of God upon the mind of the king, it means the entire complex bureaucracy we have spent chapters reading about isn't just administrative overhead, it is materialized revelation.
Exactly. And the use of the word tabnet is a highly deliberate echo of the Moses narrative. In Exodus 25, God shows Moses the tabnet, the pattern, for the tabernacle while on Mount Sinai. By using the exact same vocabulary and the same claim of direct divine transmission, the Chronicler is casting David as a new Moses.
Elevating the temple to the level of the tabernacle.
Precisely. He is elevating the theological authorization of the permanent Jerusalem temple to absolute parity with the original tabernacle in the wilderness. The man David may have had a complicated, blood-stained history, but the institutions descending from his reign are granted the highest possible divine legitimacy.
The man is managed, relocated, and forgiven, while the office and the temple remain perfectly ordered. That carefully constructed theological apparatus is what makes a close reading of Chronicles so rich, and it prepares the narrative for the actual construction of the temple, which we will cover in our next deep dive.
The institutions are now fully theorized and staffed. They simply await a building.
Which brings us to the final segment of our discussion today. We're going to transition from the analytical scholarship into a warmer, more personal devotional application, focusing on themes that resonate with our study of Come Follow Me.
When I look back over the landscape of these chapters,
do.
the image that anchors my reading is the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite in chapters 21 and 22.
Such a powerful image.
It really is. If you consider what a threshing floor is agriculturally, it is an exposed, elevated area where harvested grain is beaten and the wind is allowed to blow away the useless chaff. It is a profound, natural symbol of winnowing, of judgment.
But it becomes a literal place of judgment.
Exactly. This specific threshing floor became literally a site of divine judgment. David stands there having just witnessed the angel of destruction sheathing a drawn sword over Jerusalem. The plague has stopped, but 70,000 Israelites are dead because of the king's pride.
It is a site of utter catastrophe. But what happens to that ground? Because in many cultures, a place of mass death becomes quarantined. It becomes a cursed place associated with trauma to be avoided by future generations.
You wouldn't want to go near it.
Right. But here, the place where judgment justly fell and was subsequently absorbed and halted by sacrifice becomes the permanent, consecrated location of Israel's worship.
It becomes holy ground precisely because of what happened there. It is the specific geographical point where divine mercy intercepted divine judgment.
That has huge implications.
For a Christian reader, it is impossible to read that narrative without seeing the resonance with the atonement of Jesus Christ. The atonement occurred in real historical locations, Gethsemane, Golgotha. These were places of unimaginable agony, where a judgment that could justly have fallen upon humanity was instead absorbed by Christ.
And now they are sacred spaces.
Right. And because of that sacrifice, those places of suffering become the very foundation of our ongoing access to God. We are not suggesting that Chronicler was writing a conscious allegory of first-century Christianity, but the shape of his theology carries a profound spiritual weight. It teaches us a vital principle. Places of consequence or even failure in our own lives, places where judgment is absorbed by grace, do not have to remain places of shame. They can be consecrated as the ground from which we worship.
That is beautiful. There is also a second devotional reality to sit with, found in David's disqualification in chapter 22. David is told unequivocally that he cannot build the temple because of the blood he has shed.
He hits a wall.
He does. He is faced with a real, immovable consequence. It is not softened for him. But observe how David reacts and observe what is not lost. He's not stripped of his kingdom. He is not cut off from his relationship with God or his son. And crucially, he does not surrender to bitterness.
He doesn't just give up.
No, instead, he spends the final chapters of his life, chapters 22, 28, and 29, pouring his immense wealth, his administrative genius, and his detailed planning into a project he knows he will never personally see finished.
That is a deeply relevant model for the believer's experience. Many of us face moments where we realize we are excluded from finishing something we care deeply about. Sometimes that is due to our own past choices, as it was with David. Sometimes it is simply the reality of human limitation or changing circumstances.
We have to hand the baton off.
Exactly. David demonstrates how to make peace with having a limited part in God's larger work. He doesn't sulk, and he doesn't sabotage his successor. In his magnificent final prayer in chapter 29, he blesses the Lord and acknowledges that all the resources they are dedicating were God's property to begin with.
What does he say?
He says, "For all things come of thee, and of thine own have we given thee." That is the prayer of a man who has entirely submitted his ego and his legacy to God's timeline.
And finally, we should reflect on the concept of prophetic music, because the theological claim that the Levites were prophesying with their instruments elevates our own modern practices so much. When we sing hymns as a congregation, it can often feel routine, merely the prelude to the sermon.
Like we're just killing time before the real message.
Right. But the Chronicler's text insists that musical worship carries real, independent spiritual weight. It is a form of revelation. It is a structured way of mediating the Spirit of God. The musicians, taking up their cymbals and harps, were not providing background noise. They were doing the heavy, vital lifting of communal worship.
It challenges us to approach our own liturgy and congregational singing not as passive consumers, but as active participants in a prophetic tradition.
I want to leave you with one final, lingering question to consider, built on the text we've explored today. Consider how the chronicler's very act of compiling, editing, and copying these ancient records was, in itself, his primary form of temple worship.
He was serving God by writing.
Exactly. He was preserving the covenant by carefully telling the story of his people. So what would it look like for you if the way you curate, remember, and tell your own family's spiritual history was treated with the same sacred, authorizing weight as the ordinances themselves?
It certainly changes how we view the journals we write and the records we keep.
It really does. Next time, we will move forward into 2 Chronicles, beginning with the reign of Solomon and the physical construction of the temple. Until then.